Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to all of you who are tuning in, and welcome to all of you who are going to tune into this video of what I believe, and I think most people do believe, is a very important discussion about distance learning and broadband, which clearly is needed now more than ever. Obviously, us here on the Central Coast have been dealing with a lot of wildfires recently, the pandemic, which we're dealing with throughout our country. And then, of course, how we are pivoting, how we are adapting to get through that. And I think the best example of that type of pivoting is exactly what our schools have done when it comes to making sure that our students can still be taught. And so I want to thank all of you for tuning in, but also I want to thank our participants here for their leadership that they have shown throughout this pandemic. Now, our participants that we're fortunate enough to have our 3 county superintendents, Dr. Deneen Guss, Superintendent of the Monterey County Office of Education, Superintendent Krystal Lomanto of the San Benito County Office of Education, and Dr. Faris Sabbah, Superintendent of the Santa Cruz County Office of Education. And of course, joining us here on the Central Coast, although she's not on the Central Coast, I guarantee you she'd rather be on the Central Coast because we all want to be on the Central Coast. I want to especially thank Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel of the Federal Communications Commission. Now, just briefly, the FCC is a 5-member independent commission with jurisdiction over telecommunications and broadband regulation and tasked with implementing a whole range of broadband policies. Commissioner Rosenworcel began her service on the commission in 2012. And let me tell you, and you're going to hear it today, she's been a champion when it comes down to connectivity for all. Now, in dealing with this pandemic, in dealing with COVID-19, I think what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're experiencing is that it's really changed the way schools have operated and how teachers and students interact. Let me tell you, I've seen it firsthand as our 2 daughters who are 14 and 15 years old, freshman and sophomore in high school at the local public school here, have definitely adapted to a new way of learning. In fact, if for some reason my internet goes out, which I hope it doesn't, it will be because they're online right now in remote learning, sucking up a lot of my bandwidth that I have here in the house. But that's just one of the many questions we have to ask ourselves is how are students at home online if they can even get online? And so it's making sure that, you know, like I said, for those students with access to broadband and mobile learning devices, distance learning has enabled them to continue their education with kind of a fewer disruptions, as I've seen it with my 2 daughters. But for many others, unfortunately, it's really the lack of access to a suitable internet connections and devices can make regular learning almost impossible. And it really can put them behind relative to those classmates that have that internet access. And it's a crisis that has kind of put it in a way of, you know, demonstrating many of the inequities that unfortunately have already existed in our society. Now, the same students who struggle with distance learning, they're the same ones previously disadvantaged by the digital divide as broadband didn't reach them. But as I see it now, however, the homework gap, as I like to say, is actually turned into the schoolwork gap. And what I mean, it affects not just these students' ability to do homework, but now with this remote learning, they're failing, they won't be able to participate in a virtual classroom. So there's clearly a difference. It's not just about homework, it's about schoolwork. And so today, I thought it was important because obviously in the fall, and right now actually, as many of our children, many of our local students are going back to school, I really wanted to have a discussion to delve into the specific challenges of students and what our teachers are facing and the efforts to address them. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of our guests, especially obviously the commissioner, but those who actually have the feet on the ground with our superintendents. But let me first turn it over to Commissioner Rosenworcel for some introductory remarks. And let me tell you, Commissioner, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you joining us today and also your stalwart leadership when it comes to making sure that every student, as best as we can, has connectivity. So thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you, Congressman, for having me here today and for including me with such a dynamic lineup of your education leaders in your district. And it is true, I wish I was on your slice of the California coast right now. It is, in fact, one of the most beautiful places in the country. So you're all fortunate to call it home. Now, as you mentioned, I work at the FCC, so I spend a lot of time thinking about the digital divide. And there was a time not that long ago when broadband was considered nice to have, not need to have. But here we are now in this crazy pandemic, and work, healthcare, and education, it's all moved online. And the fact is, no kid, household, or community has a fair shot at success right now without having internet access. In fact, we need to start thinking as a nation, how do we have 100% of our homes connected to broadband? Because anything else is going to shortchange our communities and our students. And we're seeing that right now crystal clear with education. Teachers pivoted on a dime and they went from analog to digital. But we have this problem called the homework gap. You see, when I was growing up, I don't know, it took paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. That was all it took for schoolwork. But now kids need internet access. But all of the FCC data show 1 in 3 households do not have broadband. And where those numbers overlap with teachers assigning homework and doing distance learning is what you have is a homework gap. And just like the Congressman said, in this crisis, it's becoming an education gap and an opportunity gap. So I think the homework gap is the cruelest part of the digital divide. Hats off to you and your efforts to help solve it. I hope at the FCC we can convince my colleagues to do some more work with the E-rate program and make sure you can do just that for every student in your district and nationwide.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that. Now hearing from our superintendents. Faris, you want to go first or you want Deneen to go first? I'll let you guys figure it out.
I would love to go first. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'd like to start by thanking Congressman Panetta and Commissioner Rosenworcel for your leadership and for your support and for the opportunity to talk about this critical issue. I'm going to share my screen and just to share a few slides with my colleagues here. And let me go ahead and share my screen and let's make sure that everybody can see that. Can everybody see those slides? All right, wonderful. And so, you know, one of the things that I'd like to share with you for just a moment is that the crisis that we've been going through with the pandemic has really brought to the surface so many of the challenges and inequities that exist in our community. And we are currently fighting fires here in the Central Coast. And what we recognize is that connectivity is not only important for our students to have access to distance learning, it is a lifeline. It is a right that our families need to have access to be able to access a wide range of resources, information that they need when it comes to if they're facing food insecurity, if they're needing information about health and safety, with the fires needing to learn about, in many cases, we had a lot of families that were displaced and wanting to know what were the safe spaces that they could go to access services that they would need. This lifeline is so important for our families. And when we recognize that our most vulnerable families, our most disadvantaged families, were the same ones that didn't have access to internet. And those that did have access to internet didn't have it at insufficient speeds. They didn't have broadband connectivity. So we recognize that to address this digital equity challenge, we need to work together, government agencies, industry, nonprofits, having vertical articulation across local, state, and federal jurisdictions to be able to come together to address these different challenges. Our objective is to have every family with broadband speed under the FCC standard, which is at 25 megabits per second, a download speed. And we want 100% of our families to have that connectivity. We've been working hard to achieve that. We'd like to share a little bit about the data that we have been collecting that reveals that this digital equity challenge exists in our community. And we'd like to be able to also share with you some of the efforts that we've been working on. So I'd like to introduce my colleague from San Benito County, a superintendent of schools from San Benito, Krystal Lomanto.
Good afternoon. Again, I do want to send my sentiments, Congressman Panetta, for hosting this and allowing us to speak on behalf of our counties to understand the difficulties as we've transitioned into distance learning and everything that we've been doing to navigate that. So thank you, Superintendent Sabbah, to really identify the why. Why are we here? Why are we talking about this? What is the importance to this? And so, as you know, and Congressman, you started to talk a little bit, as you guys call it, the homework gap. And as we've navigated the pandemic and then added, the distance learning to the whole gamut of what we are experiencing in education, we understand the huge digital divide. And so being able to talk about that today and the why are we here? And then the data that provides the information that you need in your leadership. And Commissioner Rosenworcel, thank you for being here as well, and your leadership to understand in our counties. I'm not going to go over each set of data. You can see that on the screen, but you'll see that there's some significant percentages when we all experience rural areas, because each area, both in Santa Cruz, San Benito, and Monterey, we have areas where there is no connectivity. A hotspot will not work. There is no internet access for children. And so when you look at that, the inequities that occur during distance learning, even when there's not distance learning, right? To have the resources, you can see the numbers on the screen and the impact it's had. In San Benito County, 20% of our overall enrollment have been given a hotspot. So that means they either have no connectivity at this point, very low connectivity. So when you look at the population, Monterey County has provided their percentage as well, and then Santa Cruz. So in my opinion, one is too many. It is about all means all, and I believe I can speak on all three of us as county superintendents as we continue to navigate and support our districts and the programs that we run for our own students, understanding that the inequities that are occurring make it very difficult. And so on behalf of the data side, we want to thank you for listening to us and understanding there are some significant issues right now with the digital divide. And now I'm excited to introduce my friend and also County Superintendent from Monterey County Office of Ed, who will be closing out our presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Krystal. And good afternoon. Thank you so much, Congressman Panetta, for putting together this great opportunity to discuss the digital divide challenges and, of course, the efforts that are underway. As you mentioned in your remarks, this digital divide has been in place for a long time, but now that it has created the homework gap or the schoolwork gap or whatever we want to call it, right? The equity gap that now is getting larger and larger, it is time that we address this issue once and for all. So I'm just really pleased to review the efforts taking place in the 3 counties for closing the digital divide, and so thankful that you're creating opportunities like this to have these important dialogues. So as you see here on the screen, we have many efforts underway in all of our counties. We've created task forces to determine short and long-term solutions within counties, and of course to raise funds to help purchase the short-term solutions, which are the devices and the hotspots. We have done everything we could think of in regard to bringing the internet out to our families or turning internet outward, whether it's in libraries, school parking lots, using school buses or MST buses to bring that free Wi-Fi out to the communities. We've partnered with companies to offer low-cost options for our families. We have been conducting professional development since March. As Commissioner Rosenworcel mentioned in her comments, teachers had to turn on a dime, right? We had to learn, how do you deliver high quality instruction, now not in person, but via Zoom or via whatever platform a district's using, literally overnight. That was a huge lift. And our teachers are really doing the very best they can in this very tough situation. So professional development has continued to happen since March so that we can get better and better. We also have really been reaching out to our families via town hall meetings or other avenues to really help learn about the challenges that our families are facing and to help them get connected and teach our families, how do you use the various platforms that all of the districts are using for their distance learning programs right now. And then we've also been very fortunate in some counties, not all, but in some counties where the boards of supervisors have really jumped in and they've taken on this issue as well. I know here in Monterey County, we were very fortunate to have our Board of Supervisors actually put $1 million toward that effort. And I'm hearing from our colleagues across the state that other Board of Supervisors are even putting even more of their CARES Act funding toward this effort. So everyone is really truly realizing how important it is that we work together in partnership to address the digital divide. In summary, for our state, some counties in California have the task forces in place, as I mentioned earlier, but we also have the CDE that has created a task force and the governor that has created a task force. And many of the districts are literally getting devices from these efforts day in and day out. And that is so, so needed. While we're slowly closing a short-term device gap, the serious connectivity gap still exists. And as Krystal mentioned, in many counties, there are areas that are not serviced by any of the local internet providers. So we just have to ask ourselves, what solutions can we find as a state and as a country to address this serious need so that we can serve each and every student through high quality virtual distance learning during this pandemic and in future emergencies that may come up? These are the types of questions we're really hoping to discuss today. And I'm so thankful again to Congressman Panetta and Commissioner Rosenworcel for advocating for students, parents, and schools at the federal level to address these needed long-term solutions. And as Superintendent Sabbah mentioned in his remarks, we need that high quality internet to work in all areas of the county and at those high speeds that Superintendent Sabbah mentioned. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Congressman Panetta. I know you've got some great solutions underway, and so we're so excited to hear about those solutions.
Outstanding. Thanks to all three of you for that presentation, and not just what you've done in the past couple minutes, but what you've done in the past few months to really do one hell of a job, like I said, to pivot to do what's necessary to make sure that our students and our teachers have the proper venue in order to make sure that my children, our children, can continue to be taught, continue to learn, and continue to contribute to their schoolwork, but also to our community going forward. So truly, truly appreciate not just your time today, but I cannot stress enough how much that we appreciate your leadership here on the Central Coast, all three of you. So thank you very much. So now I know you three have some questions for their commissioner and myself. And so I'll go ahead and start it off with Superintendent Guss. I think you have for the first one, please.
Yes, so Congressman Panetta, what is the federal government's role in improving connectivity?
Yeah, I think it comes down to basically you look at the subsidizing of cost of the broadband service and equipment, and then investing in the build out of our broadband, especially in underserved areas. And the way that we've traditionally done this is by creating programs through, one, the FCC, and two, the Rural Utilities Service at the United States Department of Agriculture. Now, when you take that first part, what the FCC, what do those services include? Well, there's the Connect America Fund, which subsidizes the cost of operating and extending broadband infrastructure to serve consumers and small businesses in rural and high-cost areas. Second thing is there's the E-rate program, which provides discounts of up to 90% for broadband to and within elementary and secondary schools and public libraries. And then third, there's something called the Lifeline program, which subsidizes recurring monthly broadband services charges. And then when you look at the rural utility services, that can basically break down to a few areas as well. The Farm Bill broadband loans, which fund the costs of facilities and equipment needed to provide service in eligible rural areas. The Reconnect program, which it provides grants and loans for broadband service in areas where there's at least 90% of the households, for at least 90% of the households that do not have adequate broadband. There's the Community Connect grants, which funds broadband deployment in rural communities where it's not yet economically viable for the private sector providers to deliver service. We got a few of those here in the Central Coast. And then of course, there's distance learning and telemedicine grants to fund equipment, broadband facilities, which actually help rural communities use telecommunications to link teachers and even medical service providers to students and patients. Now you got to realize that's just a partial list of programs. There's actually 57 federal broadband programs that provide industry, state, local governments, schools, libraries, small businesses, and other institutions here in our community with the funding for expanding broadband access. Now, one of the also big plans we're looking at, kind of a 10,000 foot level, is the National Broadband Plan. Now, that was created in the Recovery Act of 2009. And Congress mandates, through that plan, Congress mandates the FCC to set out a comprehensive roadmap for providing universal internet connectivity. Now, as we know and as we've heard just on this call, it may be time to revisit the National Broadband Plan, and I'm sure the commissioner might have some things to say about that, and probably look at creating a new one that considers the lessons learned, especially from what we're all been going through during this pandemic. There's also regular reports that the FCC provides Congress to address the status of internet deployment to all Americans, and that the FCC, in one of these reports, the FCC has concluded that broadband is being deployed on a reasonable and timely basis, but it still found that 18 million Americans don't have access to broadband. So I don't think we're too sure that it's actually doing a satisfactory job, and I'd love to hear what the commissioner has to say about that report as well. But look, I think when it comes to Congress and its efforts, they've done a lot, but like most things, there's definitely more that we can do when it comes to providing additional emergency services, more flexibility, and definitely making larger investments when it comes to investing in our infrastructure.
Okay, I believe I have the next question for Commissioner Rosenworcel. What is FCC doing to keep Americans connected? And then I will have a follow-up question after this one.
All right. When the pandemic got started, the FCC did something good. And so I want to acknowledge that, which was we came up with this idea, nobody should lose their internet service during this crisis. So the agency got hundreds of carriers to commit to the idea that no one gets cut off and late fees get waived. It was a reasonable, right out the gate effort to make sure that every household that had service wouldn't lose that service during this crisis. That commitment, though, has come to an end over time. And so now we're just relying on the generosity of companies to continue it. And we're going to need new legislation, like there's legislation in the HEROES Act that has passed the House. And there's also a Keeping Critical Connections Act in the Senate that would help extend that commitment. But I think we also have to look at communities, discrete communities that are having difficulties getting everyone connected. And I think schools and students and the homework gap is part of that. So in the tour of all those programs that the congressman just listed is the E-rate program. And you probably all know this. E-rate is the largest education technology program in our country. It's been around since the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I mean, that was when most of us just had the hiss and ding of dial-up. We called it the information superhighway, but Congress saw very clearly with E-rate that connecting all of our schools and classrooms to the internet would help further education. And so E-rate supports schools in every state in the country, including Central California, to make sure that they have the bandwidth they need for education in the building. Well, let's meet this moment. Let's take that same E-rate program and use it now to make sure every child is connected at home. Let's have the E-rate program pay for those wireless hotspots, routers, modems, whatever it takes to get every student connected. We can use E-rate to close the homework gap and not just help keep Americans connected, but help keep all students connected.
So thank you. Just as a follow-up, what is the Keeping Americans Connected pledge?
Yeah, that was the pledge right out of the gate we did, which said you wouldn't cut anyone off and you'd waive your late fees. And these things are just good, right out, day one kind of activities. But here we are months later. You're starting the next school year and kids are not connected. We need more aggressive, more purposeful action. And I think we could close the homework gap if we modernize that E-rate program so it meets this moment and helps our students get connected at home.
And then just one other piece to that, do we need to do more and actually require companies to keep families connected? And you started to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, okay, well, look, we need to do more. We need to do more. We need to have every household connected to the internet. We need a kind of simple and audacious goal in this country. 100% of us connected, nothing less. And we might need the kind of plan the Congressman was talking about to get us there, but we've got to come out of this pandemic committed to that idea. And while we're in it, we need to figure out how to work with companies and work with the programs we have and pass new laws to help move it along and make it happen.
Thank you.
I have the next question. Congressman Panetta, what has Congress done so far to facilitate distance learning during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's basically what we do, advocacy and legislation. Obviously, at the start of this pandemic, once we saw what was coming down the pike, especially when it came to the homework gap and the inequalities that we've seen, I went ahead and immediately wrote a letter, authored a letter, which had bipartisan support to Secretary of Education DeVos, and urging her in that letter to provide more distance learning guidance and resources to local educators. I asked her, please develop guidance for primary, secondary, and higher education institutions so that we can create distance learning curriculums, including the best way to procure more learning equipment in our technology. I also asked her to publish this information regarding resources for the benefit of all of our educators. Now, unfortunately, the Department of Education is yet to provide these resources or provide a response. Although, what you can do and what I'm recommending is that there are very helpful resources through the Smithsonian's Learning Lab, which can be found at learninglab.si.edu/distance learning. Once again, learninglab.si.edu/distance learning. Legislatively, we passed the CARES Act, that historic, largest record-setting relief package, 2.2 trillion, which included a large amount for funding when it comes to distance learning. In fact, 13.5 billion with a B, $billion for K through 12 education, and allowing some of that money to be used for technology, and also allowing flexibility for K through 12 schools to repurpose existing education funds for distance learning technology. And then, of course, like you heard the commissioner talk about with the HEROES Act as well, and looking for infrastructure that we can go towards, put towards broadband infrastructure development as well. So once again, advocacy as well as legislation.
And I have the next question, and it is for Commissioner Rosenworcel. So you mentioned earlier that some companies provided 60 days of free service at the beginning of this pandemic. We've all seen that this pandemic has lasted longer than 60 days. So my question is, should companies do more to offer free service to struggling families?
Yeah, I remember when I thought my kids were just going to be home for 2 weeks and then it was 2 months. And now I'm not counting anymore because it's too hard. So I say that both personally and professionally. I know that there have been companies out there, broadband providers, that have made service available at low to no cost for low-income households, for students, and I think we should clap all around for their efforts. I know there are some companies that have donated computers, that have loaned out wireless hotspots that are doing incredible things around this country, and we should appreciate their generosity. But in the end, as a nation, we need to do this at scale, because we're never going to solve our digital equity problems without deciding that we're going to have the justice of getting every child, no matter who they are and where they live, connected to the internet. And that's why I'd like to see the kind of legislation that was in the CARES Act pass. I'd like to see the FCC on its own use the E-rate program. We have billions of dollars in it to help connect students at home, because we can appreciate all those really tremendous efforts that the companies have made. But I think we need to develop a national policy to make sure every child is connected, no child's left offline.
Makes sense.
So I have the next question for Congressman Panetta. What has Congress done to improve student connectivity during this pandemic?
Yeah, once again, advocacy and legislation. I also authored a letter to FCC Chairman Pai about student internet connectivity, in that letter I requested the FCC to do what it could to ensure that students have the access to distance learning tools and broadband connectivity. In that letter, I also asked that they take steps to protect consumers and work to eliminate data caps and overage fees, and also asking the FCC to provide schools with additional flexibility in using those funds, once again, and using those types of funds through the E-rate program that the commissioner talked about for distance learning. Then, of course, as you heard, we passed the HEROES Act. Now, we passed that in Congress and it's under consideration, and you've heard about the negotiations amongst everything else that's going on in Congress and in our country back in Washington, D.C. Now, in the HEROES Act, which passed out of the House, there was $5.5 billion for broadband connectivity, which included legislation that I co-sponsored, basically taking some previous legislation, putting it into the HEROES Act, called the Emergency Educational Connections Act, which provided $1.5 billion through the E-rate program so the FCC can disperse flexible funds to schools and libraries to purchase those Wi-Fi hotspots that we heard about earlier on this event, and modems and routers and other internet connected devices for students and patrons. And then it included $4 billion for $50 per month subsidies for families to help pay for those types of devices. Now, also in the HEROES Act, it included many of the consumer protections from the letter that I sent to Commissioner Pai, to Chairman Pai, excuse me, including eliminating data caps and overage fees and preventing companies from cutting off service to families who are financially affected, especially by this pandemic. Well, clearly it's going to help low-income families in areas that have the service, but it's a temporary fix. And I think we realize that. We want to focus on those families in areas not served by telecommunications companies, are not served well, and we need to do more. And that's why we need to look at broadband, not just as a pandemic, something during the pandemic relief, but more long-term as infrastructure investment.
I have a question for Commissioner Rosenworcel. What is the FCC doing to close the digital divide?
Well, how much time do you have? 'Cause I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think if you want to close the digital divide, you got to realize you have a data problem. And right now, if you look at the maps we have in Washington about where broadband is and is not, it may not meet up with your lived experience. In other words, we tend to overstate where service is and understate the scope of the digital divide. Now, I've heard that when I travel around the country and I talk to people, and they keep on saying these maps in Washington say I have service, but I'll tell you, my kids can't get online, my business is having difficulties, and I hear that everywhere. And, one of the problems is we think we can figure this out sitting alone in Washington. We can't. We're going to need everyone's lived experience to help us develop really good broadband maps. And when we have good broadband maps and proper data, you know what? We're going to be able to manage this problem. You never manage the problems you don't measure. And when we do, we'll take all of those programs at the Rural Utility Service and at the FCC and anything new Congress wants to dream up and make sure those funds flow to the right places. Because I think one of the big problems we have right now when it comes to broadband deployment in the rural communities where the networks don't reach is that we don't know with confidence that we're sending our funds to the right places. And really, when you look at what's happening in this time, that's just criminal. We're leaving some communities behind. We are consigning them to the wrong side of the digital divide because we don't have the data that accurately shows where service is and is not. So good news, Congress on a bipartisan basis passed the Broadband Data Act back in March. President signed it into law. The not so good news is that my colleagues keep on sort of clutching their pearls and saying, well, we're going to get around to it. We need a little more funding. We need to make some other things happen. I just feel like we should roll up our sleeves, get to work, put our maps out there, crowdsource some information, because the sooner we start doing that, the sooner we're going to be able to close those gaps and fix this divide.
I have a follow-up to that. What can the FCC do to expand the E-rate program? And where does it need help from Congress to do that?
All right. Well, one of the most important things that the Congressman mentioned earlier is that there are 5 commissioners at the FCC, and you're all in education, so you know to get a majority, I need 3. And right now, there's only 2 of us who would like to expand the E-rate program. But we're going to be relentless, and we're going to work with Congress because E-rate is a quiet powerhouse. For more than 2 decades, it has brought internet connectivity to some of the most rural schools in this country and some of the lowest income schools in this country. We've got to figure out how to take that program now and convert it so that schools can loan out wireless hotspots, help students get modems and routers, and make sure every child gets online to do their schoolwork in this crisis and their homework thereafter. I always think about 15 years ago, we had Hurricane Katrina in this country. And the Bush administration surveyed our existing programs, one of which is Lifeline, which helps low-income households get connected. And it made sure all of those people who are displaced from New Orleans had a way to get mobile devices and rebuild their lives. In other words, it looked at an existing program at the FCC and updated it to meet the crisis we were in. And I look at what's happening in this pandemic with remote learning and kids that fall into the homework gap, and I think we need to use the E-rate program in exactly the same way. Update it to meet this moment. And I hope I can convince my colleagues. I'm pretty relentless, but if I can't convince my colleagues, I'm hoping that Congress passes the kind of legislation that the Congressman mentioned earlier that makes the FCC go forward, update the E-rate program, and make sure no child is left behind.
Well, that brings us to the next question, and that question is for Congressman Panetta. Tell us the good news. What has Congress passed this year to improve broadband service?
Well, I think you heard part of that from the commissioner in regards to the Broadband Data Act, something that was passed on a bipartisan basis, and the president signed into law. And she talked about the many benefits of that, but also certain improvements that can be done as well. But then there was also the Securing 5G and Beyond Act, once again, passed Congress on a bipartisan basis, and the president signed it into a law. And it requires the president to consult with the FCC, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense and other agencies when in submitting to Congress a plan for rolling out Secure 5G. It's important because companies are already starting to roll out this 5G technology, and the more we can choose to use it in lieu of traditional wire networks, the stronger our internet access will be. Just let me say, when it comes to broadband and rural broadband especially, that's something I've heard from members all across Congress, Republicans and Democrats. It really is a bipartisan issue that I think with this pandemic is sort of, unfortunately kind of pushing us to get something done. What I've always heard is, there's leadership, when it comes to governing, you can govern by leadership or govern by crisis. Look, I think when it comes to ensuring broadband access, you're seeing a combination of that. I think with those early laws that I talked about, there was leadership. Now we're seeing the crisis, and that's basically having us put it into the HEROES and the CARES Act. But what it comes down to, the good thing that I can say and reassure you is that it's a bipartisan issue, that Democrats and Republicans in this administration are behind. And that's why we look forward to not just ensuring that what we passed gets implemented, but obviously looking into our infrastructure, making sure that rural broadband is a part of that.
So Commissioner, I have the next question. How is FCC helping us expand broadband access? And how can we determine where the need is? And you started to talk a little bit about this. And what is the FCC's role in broadband mapping?
Yeah, the Broadband Data Act, which we just talked a little bit about, is really important. It's the first time we've had a direction from Washington on a bipartisan, uniform basis that we've got to figure out where service is and is not in this country. Because then we'll take programs at the federal, state, and local level and make sure the resources are there and going to the right places to extend the reach of our networks. I think that is really job one when it comes to expanding broadband to the places that don't have it. But I also hope that we think a little bit about affordability, because there are certainly places where people have access to broadband, but they can't afford it. And I think we're going to have a dialogue about affordability along with deployment if we really want to solve our digital divide in a comprehensive way.
Congressman Panetta, I think I have the last question for you.
Right.
What can Congress do to build out broadband infrastructure? Because we recognize that's an important part of the solution.
Yeah, look, I think if you look at a bill we passed just earlier this summer, HR 2, the Moving Forward Act, it's a $1.5 trillion infrastructure package, but within that, it includes a $100 billion investment for broadband. And it gets back to what I said earlier, basically ensuring that broadband is part of how people think of infrastructure. Clearly, we need it. We're talking about it. We're using it. Therefore, we want to make sure that any bills that come forward that deal with infrastructure, they include broadband. In this bill, HR 2, it included $80 billion over a 5-year period to deploy secure, high-speed broadband infrastructure. $5 billion over 5 years for low-interest financing of broadband deployment through a new program that would allow eligible entities to apply for secured loans, lines of credit, and loan guarantees to finance broadband infrastructure and build out projects. And there's also something that's kind of interesting here. You don't really think about this, but there was a provision in this bill called the Dig Once provision. And basically that ensures coordination when it comes to broadband infrastructure projects, so that you don't have to dig twice, because you know that basically a lot of the infrastructure will be laying this cable down. So making sure you're working with all the entities involved to make sure that you only have to dig once rather than twice. And that obviously saves a heck of a lot of money. And then it also establishes an Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth, which is responsible for coordinating other agencies to ensure the efficient use of federal funding. I think we've learned you hope we learned our lesson when it comes down to spending too much and making sure it's spent efficiently and wisely. But I do believe that when it comes to broadband, this is a type of investment that we need to make when we're thinking long-term. And that's why I voted for this. And I hope that if it doesn't get taken up in this Congress, I do hope that the next administration and the next Congress and the 117th Congress takes this up. Because like I said, there is support for it, not just because of this pandemic, but because it's the right thing to do for our students, for our businesses, for our communities, and ultimately for our country. So I know we're running out of time. What I'd like to do is just briefly give it to the commissioner just to say any final words. Commissioner, I'd love to hear any final thoughts. We all would like to.
Well, thank you for focusing on this and the knowledge that you bring to this issue, and all of the educators here. I hope when we look back on this moment, there are two things that we do. The first is that we appreciate the unbelievable effort of our nation's educators to move from analog to digital, like we said before, virtually overnight. And then I also hope that we used this crisis to make sure that we solve the homework gap, and that going forward, no child is left offline.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you very much, Commissioner Rosenworcel. And of course, Superintendents Guss, Lomanto, and Sabbah. Thank you for taking your time to be here today, for your commitment to this issue. All four of you, thank you very much. Look, I think we know it's clear. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do in Congress. We have a lot of work to do in our communities. But I think it's these types of conversations with this foundation that we need to have, upon which we can start not just talking, but actually doing when it comes to the serious investment that's needed to build out our broadband and to push for universal connectivity. I think we know this crisis, we hope and we pray that this crisis will pass and that our students do return to the classrooms. But online learning, as it's said, it's going to continue to be a larger part of our students' education. It's going to continue to be a larger part of our lives. And so this issue is not tied to distance learning. It's not tied to this virus. And so we have to make sure that we continue to have these types of conversations so that every student, and to be frank, every person has the access to the internet that everybody should going forward. Like I said, in our communities, here on the Central Coast and across our country. That will be my commitment in Congress. I'm sure it's the commissioner's commitment, and I know that it's our superintendent's commitment, especially when it comes to our children. So thank you, everybody, for participating. Look forward to continuing to have these types of conversations and look forward to working with you as we go forward out of this pandemic and into the future, especially when it comes to connectivity. Thank you, everybody.